Some people think the dangerous quarter is the bad quarter. I've come to distrust the good ones. That quarter where sales waxes lyrically, leadership has rose tinted glasses on, and operations are asked to just stop being so negative all the time. That's the dangerous quarter. In this discussion, you'll be able to identify these dangerous quarters and how to prevent them from happening. I want to start with a click in Factorio. I open the upgrade planner. I drag it across a belt line. The belts turn red, they move faster. The factory looks sharper, more adult, more like it should have a vice president standing next to it in a stock photo. And for about 4 seconds, I feel brilliant. Then nothing important changes. Research doesn't speed up. The shortage doesn't quite disappear, and the line is still starving. That tiny moment is this whole discussion, because that's how a lot of organizations get quote unquote improved. Somebody touches the most visible part of the system, sees more motion, and decides the system itself must now be better, right? I'm vulnerable to this. I've always been vulnerable to this. Give me a diagram with clean arrows and sober nouns, and I become much easier to fool. Give me a chart that implies the world is made of functions which behave themselves, and I begin forgiving crimes in advance. Then games fix my attitude, because they don't allow me to comfortably linger in the abstract. Games are rude. Games don't care whether the diagram is elegant. Games care whether the system pays out or collapses. Games fail you harshly when you keep living in abstract la-la land. And Factorio is particularly rude because it humiliates you with arithmetic disguised as infrastructure. When you actually play it, one lesson arrives pretty much immediately. The factory hates short-range thinking. Build for the next 5 minutes, and the layout that felt efficient in minute 5 becomes a liability at minute 20. After a while, you learn to leave room before you fully understand why. You learn to respect upstream pressures before you can articulate the term. You discover that copper, circuits, smelting, power, and even logistics all have a way of returning later to punish your earlier confidence. The game basically lets you feel smart early. Then it sends your earlier self an invoice. That is where Rex comes in. Rex runs operations at a steel business. Sales wants to know whether the plant can move from 10 tons a week to 100 if an account lands. We don't need 100 tons forever, just long enough to win the business. That sentence contains an entire theology of sales optimism. It's asking whether operations can lend sales a future it hasn't really quite earned yet. It sounds like a sales question. In reality, I'll tell you, it's really an operations question wearing cologne. The real question is what breaks first, not where value is created. This is where I want to introduce Porter carefully and then keep going one layer deeper than the way managers usually stop. For those of you that don't know, Michael Porter is a renowned Harvard Business School professor who revolutionized business strategy with concepts like the value chain and competitive advantage. Michael Porter's value chain explains how a company breaks down its activities to understand where it creates value and gains a competitive advantage. The value chain is so fundamental to our thinking about organizations, we often don't even realize that we're using his tool. Porter's actual opening move is stronger than the way people imitate him. He doesn't treat the firm like a pile of disconnected departments. He treats strategy as coordinated policy aimed at goals. He warns that if the spokes of the wheel don't connect, the wheel doesn't roll. He tests strategy for fit, for coherence, for resources, and most importantly, for our example, for timing. Timing is where a neat chart turns into a live animal. So the thesis here is pretty simple. Porter is useful when he forces you to ask whether the parts of the business reinforce one another. Porter becomes dangerous in managerial hands when that discipline collapses into something cheaper. Somebody names the activity, measures the cost, optimizes that specific activity, and calls that result strategy. Some people think that simplification is basically Porter. Optimizing your part of the organization without looking further than your nose and then calling it what Porter would want. And the reason I know this is because I have done this too many times than I can remember, both in real life and Factorio. I've spent so much time staring at that stupid Factorio click. You upgrade the belt. Why did you upgrade the belt? Well, because it's visible, because it moves, because you can point at it in one sentence. Speed on a screen has the moral force of progress. A faster belt feels like a more serious organization in exactly the way a cleaner dashboard feels like better management, even when the dashboard is faithfully reporting the wrong thing. The red belt is a fantasy object. It lets you perform competence before you've traced causality. And then the game punishes that fantasy. You look at the slow moving line. You decide the belt must be the problem, so you upgrade it. The animation gets cleaner, and the humiliation arrives a few seconds later. The shortage is still there. The line was starving before, it's starving now. The only thing that changed is that emptiness moves faster. Such a good management lesson, I almost resent it. You did not increase useful output. You increased the transport speed of a shortage. Now the game makes you walk backward through your own mistakes. The circuits are late because copper is short. Copper is short because the smelters are capped. The smelters are capped because the line has nowhere to grow. And the line has nowhere to grow because earlier you was optimizing for neatness rather than scale. That's not exactly a game quirk. That is every company that trims excess capacity right up until demand arrives and reveals that excess was simply the polite term for resilience. A buffer that was necessary, but underappreciated because it becomes invisible the moment we don't immediately use it. The game has another lesson that is even meaner: the power dip. If you've played long enough, you know the feeling. The factory starts to dim, the drill's slow, coal arrives later, then the dimming gets worse. At first, it feels like a local inconvenience. A few seconds later, though, it's obvious you're inside a self-reinforcing failure loop. One underfed support line has begun teaching you a lesson about civilization itself. That's basically management in a nutshell. A support function looks expensive, so someone trims it. Response time weakens somewhere else, and that slowdown reduces the supply of the thing that was keeping the first function stable. Now, the original efficiency move comes back dressed as a cascade failure. This is why I get impatient when cost cutting gets discussed like a morality play. Cost cutting is not morally simple, it's mechanically conditional. Some spending is just spending and should be cut. Other spending is a stabilizer. So maintenance can be a stabilizer, internal logistics can be one, repair bandwidth can be one, scheduling depth can be one, buffer inventory can be one too, mm, documentation can be one, and sometimes one boring senior operator who knows exactly where the plant lies to itself is. Every buffer could be a stabilizer or superfluous. Even worse, buffers that were once stabilizers can become superfluous. None of this looks glamorous on a slide. You feel money when it's spent, and stabilization buffers are always invisible and underappreciated even when they're used. When it's there, people take it for granted. I'm sure you felt that way about yourself sometimes. When it's not there, well, people freak out, but never blame the ones that cut the buffer in the first place. Not only is the buffer invisible, the person that cuts the buffer is also invisible. And that quality makes it so tantalizing for a next quarter only manager to cut it. Not my problem later, and my bonus now. No one will know. How would they know? And that brings me to the term I want to install in this discussion. Load-bearing capacity is the range of volume an organization can sustain without flipping hidden supports into failure. It has a floor and a ceiling. The floor is the minimal viable volume that keeps the business economically and procedurally intact. In our steel mill, we can only go as low as 10 tons per week, or else we need to power down the mills. If we do that, starting them up again becomes financially unviable. Porter states clearly that we cannot just look at money or just procedures that are the bottleneck for minimal viable volume. They influence each other. The ceiling is the highest sustainable volume before some support function, timing relationship, or coordination mechanism starts to fail. In our steel mill, we can go high as 60 tons per week, but we run into completely different problems. Support, materials, coordination are all important factors. The buffers that lie idle at the minimal viable volume are crucial at the highest sustainable volume. If you followed all that, the trick with buffers is always to create as much sustainable volume with a minimum of costs. Let me emphasize the word sustainable out of the highest sustainable volume, because managers cheat on this point constantly. Any company can have one glorious week. That proves almost nothing. Any person can do one reckless sprint on a bad knee. The interesting question is what the body can actually sustain without sending the bill later. Rex does not need one number from his plant. Rex needs the entire bandwidth of his steel mill. And this is where management conversation becomes embarrassing, because somebody in the meeting will open a Porter slide or the spiritual equivalent of one. Inbound, operations, outbound, sales, service, support activities around the outside. Very clean, very official, very expensive looking. In the bad way, ideas love to look expensive. And I want to stop the meeting there and ask one rude question. Which of those boxes becomes false first if volume multiplies by 10? A labeled activity is still only a category. It becomes strategically useful when translated into something harder edged. A capacity number, a staffing lag, a maintenance interval, a queue length, a truck turnaround problem, a yard congestion problem, a defect threshold, a supervisor span issue. The morale problem that spends 3 weeks disguising itself as a quality problem before you realize that pizza parties just won't fix it anymore. Porter helps you see that departments cannot be treated as independent little kingdoms. That's valuable. What Porter doesn't do for you, and what no clean category map can do for you by itself, is answer the harder question. What happens when those departments are overburdened? So, when Rex answers sales, the work starts one layer below the chart. Can procurement source enough input fast enough? Can receiving unload it without turning the yard into a messed up parking lot? Can internal handling move it? Can staffing absorb it? Can maintenance keep uptime without borrowing from next month? Can quality handle faster turnover without rising scrap? Can outbound clear the product? Can customer service survive the predictable increase in exceptions once the plant leaves its comfort zone? Now, let's stay with Rex for a minute because this is where the discussion needs a real example and not another tidy conclusion. So, Rex is walking into the meeting. The sales is excited, finance is doing that predatory curiosity finance gets when volume is mentioned. Leadership is already halfway into sentences that begin with, if we can just. And Rex says, before I answer, I need to know whether you mean possible, repeatable, or survivable. That is the right first sentence. Sales says, we just need to know if the plant can do it. Rex says, for how long? Sales says, long enough to close. And Rex says, that phrase describes intent. I need an actual time unit. Well, as you can imagine, the room gets pretty annoyed with this because this is where operation becomes socially inconvenient. Operations is the function that insists reality arrives before the promise. Every commercial culture finds that annoying right up until the invoice stops being collectible. So Rex starts unpacking it. At 10 tons, the plant is comfortable. At 20, the plant is routine. Now, at 40 tons, the plant is still sane if procurement gets protection and maintenance window stays intact. At 60, the plant can likely perform, but now the system is leaning hard on discipline. And at 100 tons, the plant can probably touch the number for a short interval by spending future reliability, future quality confidence, and future labor patience. That's not really pessimism. It's load-bearing literacy. And this is where I want against the storm in this discussion, because it teaches a different failure pattern. Both games are about buffers, but not in the same way. Factorio teaches something I like to call linear throughput humiliation. With Factorio, you fail due to not understanding what you need in a later stage. You haven't built enough throughput to reach your goal. You haven't built buffers that allow you to absorb inside future expansion. Against the storm teaches compound pressure humiliation. With Against the Storm, you fail due to an impossibility to know what you're going to need externally. You haven't built enough buffers to be capable of taking the pressure from outside that you cannot predict. If you've never played Against the Storm, here's the only part you need to know. The game keeps multiple pressure gauges in front of you at once. One side tracks your progress. Another tracks how close you are to political failure. Elsewhere, the game keeps throwing you objectives, glade risks, and species moods that don't naturally want the same thing. It's an unusually honest way to represent management pressure. The game doesn't let you pretend there is one clean score called success. You're juggling multiple clocks at once, and the danger comes from the way individually manageable pressure starts interacting. There's an orders button where the lesson gets surgical. When you play, that button feels comforting for exactly the reason bad management habits feel comforting. It turns the mess into a list. It gives you a target. It makes progress visible. It creates the sensation that if you simply execute the objective in front of you, the whole board will sort itself out. Let me tell you, that sensation is deadly. You press the button, you choose the objective, you feel responsible. And then the game teaches the hard lesson. An order can be sensible in the moment, yet systematically stupid. That sentence is more useful to management than half the airport books in the business section. And here's what it feels like in play. You pick an order because it looks efficient, it promises progress, it feels disciplined, and it gives you the pleasant managerial dopamine rush of a crisp target. But you haven't taken into account the external factors, and they will come to bite you. A delayed problem sits too long. Impatience rises. Resolve slips. Labor gets allocated badly. One species might be fine, but another one's close to revolt. Your original decision still makes sense in isolation. The settlement deteriorates because several tolerable pressures line up at the same time. That pattern is basically management. A lot of organizations don't fail because one department's weak. They fail because several manageable pressures line up at once. And then the death spiral starts. Procurement is a little tight, maintenance is a little deferred, training's a little shorter, scheduling is denser than it ought to be, quality review gets faster in ways no one wants to name, sales is half a beat ahead of operations, as usual. Nobody is individually insane. The aggregate becomes insane. This is why I keep Porter on the part of the problem where he clarifies coordinated activity. And then I stop when the problem becomes multi-constraint stress rather than sequential description. A great example of where Porter gets used wrongly time after time is when cost cutting needs to happen. The bad version always sounds neat. A support function, overhead, back office, trim it. Many times HR is in the lead for cutting costs without understanding anything about the organization, just what the Porter slides tell them. That's the vocabulary of people who think naming a thing is understanding it. The language tells you something immediately. The cut is being organized by labels, not by consequences. By HR, by incompetence, not with thought, not with responsibility. Want to spot what that looks like in real life? Organizations rehiring the people they fired. The better question is harder to ask and much more useful. If this goes away, what breaks next? What gets slower? What delay stops being absorbable? What hidden dependency suddenly becomes visible? Take a good look at your buffers, the people that manage them, and how likely it is the buffers are going to be. The right way is consequence cutting. If I cut this cost, what secondary behavior changes? What queue gets longer? What response time gets worse? What ugly but necessary delay absorber disappears? What error becomes harder to recover from? What dependency, previously hidden, becomes suddenly political because now it is failing? And now, I've heard managers describe the same lived problem. And frankly, I've experienced it too. They sense that something is wrong before they can defend it in officially acceptable language. Then they go looking for the concrete facts that allow the organization to hear them. That is a serious managerial skill. It's also the exact place where many organizations betray themselves. Because if Rex says, "I do not like this cut," the room often hears emotion where it should hear early warning. The right response is different. Fine. What mechanism are you afraid of? Layer it down. Drill until the feeling becomes an observable consequence. Another uncomfortable point matters just as much. Managers sometimes ignore the first reservation because the rational case sounds stronger. Then, only after failure do they realize what the initial reservation was trying to tell them. That hurts because it's true. Most organizations don't lack intelligence. They lack permission structures for socially inconvenient truth. They accept reasoning more readily than correct unease. And yet the serious literature on judgment doesn't treat intuition and analysis as enemies. They're actually partners. Good. That means the adult move is neither mysticism nor spreadsheet fundamentalism. Use intuition as a searchlight, then verify it. That is cost cutting with dignity, and it also gives Rex a usable method. If finance wants to cut maintenance over time, Rex does not have to say, I feel bad about it. What he can say is that over time currently prevents downtime in the following failure modes. Remove it, and the output may stay flat for 2 weeks. Then drop in a pattern the company will misattribute to quality or staffing. Here's the mechanism. If someone wants to cut internal logistics, Rex can say fine, then truck turnaround increases, queuing increases, melt scheduling loses flexibility, and the apparent savings will come back dressed as delay and scrap. That is what load-bearing thinking does. It forces managers to ask whether a cost is superfluous or structural. Now that we understand Porter's value chain and how we can use it for the minimum and maximum volume, I want to discuss another way to use the same tool. I want to talk about expansion and acquisition. Porter is more useful here than the people who quote him lazily or just use his tools without understanding or even ever having heard of them. Capacity, expansion, and entry into new businesses belong inside strategy, not behind it. Good, because growth is not simply more, growth is synchronized strain. And that line really does deserve a scene. So let's say Rex's plant decides to double output over 6 months. On the slide, that looks like an operations question. In real life, it's a procurement question, then a hiring question, then training, maintenance, scheduling, inventory, quality, yard flow, and eventually customer service once the exception rates start climbing. That's why Factorio is such a good lab for this. A second resource site looks simple right up until you have to integrate it. What looked like more ore becomes rail layout. Unload timing, routing, storage, signaling, congestion, and fresh dependence on power and upstream handling. The game keeps teaching the same lesson. Scale arrives as a coordination burden, and that is simply expansion within your own organization. The moment we start thinking about acquiring another organization, the Porter problem doubles. The acquisition question is not just whether both firms possess similar functions. No. The real question is whether the new spokes of the wheel can attach to the same wheel without breaking internal consistency, resource fit, or timing. Two companies can both have operations and still be incompatible. Different cadence, different defect tolerance, different maintenance discipline, different supervisory depth, different data quality, different decision latency, different tolerance for improvisation, and different ways of lying to themselves once volume starts stressing the system. A merger can look additive at that level of labeled boxes and subtractive at the level of timing. That's a sentence I want leaders to hear before they say synergy with a straight face. If the acquisition increases the maximum sustainable volume more than it increases friction, maybe you have something. If the acquisition allows you to pool the right buffers so you can overlap them, maybe you have something. If the acquisition can lower your minimal viable volume by adding more clients from the new company that always needs a small trickle of steel, maybe you have something. The final way I want to discuss Porter's value chain is not focused on production at all. You know what they say. The core of every organization is someone needs to build the product and someone needs to sell the product. So, how do we use Porter's value chain for sales? How to govern sales by the floor and ceiling. This is the one I care about most because it is where strategy stops being a lecture and starts becoming an operating answer. X shouldn't give sales a number. He should give sales a capacity band. 10 tons is comfortable, 20 is routine with current staffing, 40 is possible with supply guarantees and schedule protection, 60 is possible if maintenance windows are deliberately managed, and 100 is touchable only by converting future damage into present. Frankly, glamour has nothing to do with it. This is the answer of someone who understands what the organization is made of. And once Rex knows the band, he can govern sales correctly. Which deals fit the healthy zone, which deals are attractive but destabilizing, which customer promises force the plant into fake strength, which pieces of revenue are really advances taken against next quarter's reliability. That is what load-bearing capacity becomes when you finally take it seriously. It tells sales where the firm should hunt and get more customers. It tells finance which margins are fictional because the extra costs outweigh the extra out. In short, it tells leadership which growth targets are numerically impressive and operationally juvenile. Now, I want one more return to the games before the close. Back to that Factorio button. That moment is important because it exposes the exact level where your thinking stopped. You improved the visible mechanism. The real constraint was deeper in the chain. The failed improvement became a diagnosis. You were thinking at the level of visible speed. The system was constrained at the level of upstream supply. That gap between your explanation and the system's explanation is management education in pure form. Now, go back to Against the Storm. The orders button is important because the game keeps demonstrating a very adult fact. An objective can be correct and still destabilize the whole system if it pulls on the wrong pressures at the wrong time. That is the thing many managers don't really want to hear. Local correctness is not enough. Category correctness is not enough. Process compliance isn't always enough either. The system gets the final vote. Reality gets the final vote. And that's why I want to close with the famous swordmaster Miyamoto Musashi. Musashi taught that mastery comes from adapting to reality, not clinging to rigid beliefs. So one should act accordingly to what works, not what feels true. Do not become attached to one favored weapon, he teaches, one favored method, one favored cut. His correction is harsh and clean and is the perfect complement to Porter. Porter with Musashi brings you victory. Porter without Musashi brings you abstract la la land. So, where do I land? I use Porter to force coordination. I use Porter to ask whether the parts of the business reinforce one another. You should use Porter to make departments stop pretending they are independent kingdoms. Then use games or anything else honest enough to embarrass you to remember that the chart never becomes the stress test. It is reality that is the key driver. Always. Factorio tells you the slowest thing in the system still owns you. Against the Storm tells you several manageable pressures can become fatal when they synchronize. Managers often feel the crack before they can name it, and the serious move is to investigate it rather than worship it or suppress it. Musashi tells you to avoid falling in love with the method that used to work. And if Rex learns one thing from the meeting, I want it to be this: reality will dictate what happens, but you have the power to understand and prepare correctly. In a world of uncertainty, only the ones who understand the limits of their organization can go to bed safely, knowing for certain they are prepared for everything and the kitchen sink. I'd like to take the time to thank the Factorio subreddit, the Against the Storm subreddit, and the Discord where we discuss these topics before they go live. Please, if you could, like, share, and subscribe if you found any value to this video. But if you really want to help the channel, click on one of these videos. We'll see you next week with new insights and games here on Tactical Mindscapes. Thank you for watching.